because we have his method, we have his teaching, and he teaches us what, this is, I loop back now to Dr. Dembski's first element of his critique, to having to know that to be educated is to understand how little you know and how little you understand. Dr. Dembski seems to think he's laid some kind of gigantic egg that's about to hatch a huge squawking chicken, when he points out that among evolutionists and among physicists and others, there are huge differences and disagreements. That's true. It's also going to get much, much more intense. If you want to see a really strong argument take place, go and talk to Richard Dawkins and ask him about his view of Stephen Jay Gould's, another great paleontologist, arguments on punctuated evolution. There are tremendous differences within our school. There's a huge amount yet to be known or explained. But we don't take anything on faith. There's no dogma. There are no tablets. We go where the evidence leads us. And, for example, when the last outbreak of flu virus occurred, because we know something about the genetic things we have in common with bacteria and viruses, and we were able to sequence the DNA of the last such virus in 1919, didn't take us very long to get a vaccine that could prevent the last flu from being as bad as the previous one. It works. It works. You can make sound medical predictions based on it. Medicine's impossible without the work of evolution and genetics. And you should be grateful for it. But it doesn't mean there's no God. It just means that we have what we think are better explanations for our human nature. I think that runs me out perfectly.
It does.
And again, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Dembski.
Very good. The topic of this debate is on the existence and goodness of God, and I want to focus on in this next 10 minutes on the goodness of God, arguing for that. But I do want to just say a few things about some of the comments that Christopher Hitchens just made. The claim that atheism predates evolution. I mean, it's certainly true that atheism predates Darwin's theory of evolution, but the idea that nature, the material world, is all there is, that there are no gods, no transcendent intelligence, nothing beyond this material world, that is an old notion, and those notions often have, I mean, if that's all you've got, nature basically has to do its own creating, its own self-organizing. And it's not surprising then that in the materialist philosophers of old, Christopher mentions Lucretius, for instance, you have a prototype of Darwinian evolution, of natural selection in his De Rerum Natura. I mean, I read this with my students. So evolutionary ideas go back a long way. They don't take precisely the form of Darwinism, but if you are an atheist, that's really the only game in town. Matter, the natural world, has to organize itself. And if you look at the old creation myths, Enuma Elish, the Greek creation myths, Hesiod's Theogony, what you find are natural forces, the cosmic egg, the waters, Tiamat and Apsu, sweet and salt waters in the Babylonian mythology, and they organize themselves, and then finally at the end you get Marduk, the prince of the gods. So you go from simplicity to complexity, and that's always the direction of evolution. Now it's interesting, he brings up vestigiality, the cave fish. It's a very different thing losing an eye and gaining an eye. I mean, if you have an eye, you go put the fish in a cave, you have these cave fish, and all you need to do is disable some gene or some promoter or something, and the eye is gone, and it's not needed. Evolution doesn't have to try to get it back because it's gone and it's not needed. But getting the eye in the first place, that's the problem. That's where the design comes in. Christopher mentions the appendix. Actually, the appendix has a use. I mean, it's recently been found that it's a repositor of these probiotics. And it's been implicated in the immune system. I mean, that's been known actually for a number of years. But so whenever you ascribe vestigiality, you are in danger of making an argument from ignorance, because it may be that some use ends up being found. Although I would admit that with the cave fish, that's not going to happen. The claim that medicine would be impossible without evolution, what are we talking about? I mean, nobody in the intelligent design community doubts that Darwin or let me put it positively, everybody accepts that Darwin got something right. The point is, how big of a picture, how much did he get right? Natural selection certainly operates. It explains how bacteria will gain antibiotic resistance, how insects will get insecticide resistance, but it doesn't explain how you get bacteria or insects in the first place. And that's the big claim. That's the whopper that we are being asked to believe on materialist grounds. And there's no evidence for that. Small-scale evolutionary change is no problem. They can follow Darwinian patterns. We accept that. But this is always a problem in science, where you take a theory, get a good idea, and then you try to totalize it and apply it to everything. And what you find is that usually after time you find that the scope of the theory needs to be contracted and that there is a proper range of applicability of the theory. And that's, I think, what we found with Darwin. So Darwin was a great scientist. I don't mean to take anything away from him, but this totalization of Darwin has continued. And to mention Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins, if you read Stephen Jay Gould's great tome at the end, this 1,400-page brontosaurus of a book on the structure of evolution, what you find is that he, in the end, capitulates to Darwin, that Darwin got it basically right. Punctuated equilibrium is just a slight modification. It's not a revolution within Darwinian thinking. So I could go on about this, but I do want to address the goodness of God, since that is also a stated topic of the debate. So last time I argued that God exists. The next order of business is to establish God's goodness. It's here that Hitchens mounts his loudest attack against religious people and against God himself. His motto in such attacks is, heads I win, tails you lose. Thus, if religious people behave badly, that counts against God. On the other hand, if they behave well, that means nothing, because non-religious people can behave well also. In establishing God's goodness, let's therefore first level the playing field. The 6th century Christian philosopher Boethius helps us here. In his Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius states the following paradox. If God exists, whence evil? But whence good if God does not exist? Boethius contrasts the problem that evil poses for theism with the problem that good poses for atheism. The problem of good does not receive nearly as much attention as the problem of evil, but it is the more basic problem. That's because evil always presupposes a good that has been subverted or corrupted. All our words for evil make this plain. The New Testament word for sin, Greek hamartia, presupposes a target that's been missed. Deviation presupposes a way, a via, Latin via, from which we've departed. Injustice presupposes justice, and so on. So let's ask, who's got the worst problem, the theist or the atheist? Start with the theist. God is the source of all being and purpose. Given God's existence, what sense does it make to deny God's goodness? None. Indeed, denying God's goodness is logically and rationally incoherent. It's absurd. To see this, consider what it would mean to assert that God is not good. Presumably, this would mean that God violated some moral standard. Whose moral standard? One devised by Christopher Hitchens? God owes Hitchens nothing, nor does he owe us any. He owes us nothing either. I want to add that. To say that God is not good must therefore mean that God has violated an objective moral standard. But since God is the source of all being and purpose, any such objective moral standard cannot reside outside God. Such a standard must therefore derive from God himself. But in that case, how can God violate it? God himself is the standard then. God's goodness follows as a matter of definition once God's existence is taken for granted. This may seem like a cheat, but it's not. The problem of evil still confronts theists, though not as a logical or philosophical problem, but instead as a psychological or existential one. The problem of evil can therefore be reformulated as the following argument. Since God is good, he wants to destroy evil. Since God is all-powerful, he can destroy evil. Evil is not yet destroyed. Therefore, God will eventually destroy evil. As time-bound creatures, our problem here is with the word eventually. We want to see evil destroyed now. And because we don't see it destroyed now, and thus experience the suffering that evil invariably inflicts, we are tempted to doubt God's existence and goodness. Our challenge, therefore, is to continue trusting God until evil is destroyed. Hitchens' long litany of evils, especially those committed in the name of religion, is designed to derail our trust in God's goodness. by getting us to think that if God really were good, he would have taken care of evil by now. I want to just go back because I think I wasn't quite as clear as I wanted to be. In terms of God's goodness, it seems either we are going to have to admit that God is the standard because everything follows from him, or we're going to have to refer the goodness to some subjective standard of some creature, but that God himself is not going to be bound by that. That cannot be the standard of goodness ultimately. So yes, I would argue, and I have argued, that once you have God, it really is incoherent to affirm that God isn't good. But as I said, there's still a problem when we have to deal with evil in the world. And I'm leaving this argument at a pretty general philosophical level. I mean, I'm not, the debate topic, I'm trying to stay with this, is the existence and goodness of God. And I'm taking God very generically. I'm not getting into specifics of Christian theology. I'm treating this more as a question in philosophy of religion. Okay, so we have now the existential problem of evil. God's goodness in the face of the world's evil is, as Boethius noted, a problem. It's not an insuperable problem, but neither is it a trivial one. By contrast, the problem of good in the face of God's non-existence, the other half of Boethius's paradox, is, I submit, insuperable. The problem of good as it faces the atheist is this, and you need to pay close attention here. Nature, which is nuts and bolts reality for the atheist, has no values and thus can offer no grounding for good and evil. As 19th century freethinker Robert Greene Ingersoll used to say, in nature there are neither rewards nor punishments, there are only consequences. By the way, my dad was a biologist, he taught evolutionary biology, and this was one of his favorite expressions growing up. Ingersoll made this comment in the 19th century. More recently, Richard Dawkins has made the same point. Quote, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Close quote. Values on the atheist view are subjective and contingent. They reflect inclinations to behave and feel in certain ways given the conditions of survival and reproduction under which our ancestors evolved and the social conditions under which we've been reared. Hitchens speaks of moral values as being innate and waxes indignant when they are violated. But on atheist principles, what is the force of morality and what justifies such indignation? Hitchens, for instance, is incensed with religious communities that practice female genital mutilation. So am I. But without an objective moral standard, which atheism cannot deliver, Hitchens himself is at bottom a complicated piece of matter that evolutionary and social conditioning have inclined to react in certain ways to certain behaviors. In particular, he reacts quite negatively to this practice. But religious communities that engage in this practice are quite content to continue it. Moreover, on atheistic principles, they have the better argument, for they are surviving and reproducing quite nicely, indeed out-reproducing the secular West. On atheist principles, morality is, as Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson note, an illusion fobbed off by our genes to get us to cooperate. This statement by Ruse and Wilson is very widely quoted, but too often the punchline gets omitted. Let me read you the punchline. This comes at the end of that passage. Morality or ethics is illusory. Okay, they've just said that it's an illusion. It's illusory, but why? Inasmuch as it persuades us that it has an objective reference. That's the punchline. See, for morality to work, it has to convince us that there's an objective reference, because if we realize that it's just bunk, then we're not going to do it. We have to be deluded into thinking that there is an objective moral standard to which we have to bow down. And as long as we're deluded in that way, then we can be moral. So this is their point. That's the kicker. Christopher Hitchens is morally earnest. So is the female genital mutilation community. Try to convince either that they're wrong and get into the fight of your life. But their passionate moral convictions on atheist principles merely show that they fooled themselves into thinking that morality is objective and universally binding. No, on atheist principles, all that's going on is one group of material objects. Enlightenment rationalists, like Christopher Hitchens, are inclined to one set of behaviors, and another group of material objects, female genital mutilators, inclined to another set